in many countries where, crises take place in emerging markets, it's often because sensible and fairly commonsensical things have been delayed, not that the problem is rocket science.
While currently a senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School and managing director at Alvarez & Marsal, Dr. Reza Baqir served as the 20th governor of Pakistan's Central Bank, the State Bank of Pakistan, from May 2019 to May 2022. During his time as governor, Dr. Baqir negotiated a new IMF program, successfully completed 6 subsequent reviews, and led the country's financial response during the COVID-19 pandemic. He also led several institutional reforms, including the liberalization of Pakistan's foreign exchange market from a fixed to a flexible regime, revision of the central bank law to strengthen its independence, implementation of Russian digital accounts for Pakistanis overseas, and several digitization initiatives to promote efficiency and inclusion in the financial sector. Previously, Dr. Baqir spent 19 years with the IMF and 2 years with the World Bank, where he held numerous senior policy and country positions in several regions, including East Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. He started and headed the IMF's office in Egypt as senior resident representative and headed the IMF's debt policy division, which oversees the IMF's work on addressing debt sustainability and sovereign debt restructuring. Dr. Baqir resigned from the IMF for public service in his home country. Dr. Baqir's research has been published in the Journal of Political Economy and the Quarterly Journal of Economics, amongst other journals. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of California at Berkeley and an AB, magna cum laude, in economics from Harvard University. He joins us today in our latest Advocata Conversations.
Welcome, Reza Baqir, to Advocata's Conversation.
Thank you, Murtaza. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I wish we could have done this in person, but better late than never. So very much looking forward to the conversation.
Maybe we can start first, Reza, and ask you a little bit about your story. Why don't you tell us what your background is, what your education is, what your work experience has been?
Well, I'd be delighted to. So, Murtaza, I was born and raised in Lahore. I was, from the very beginning, learned, I think, the values of education. Was fortunate to go to a good school in Lahore called Aitchison College. I went there from first grade all the way to what we call in Pakistan O-levels and A-levels, or senior Cambridge and higher senior Cambridge. And it was, on the one hand, a school that had very good academics, at the same time also gave you opportunities for sports as well as for many extracurriculars. So I thoroughly enjoyed, Aitchison College. Was also lucky to become the head boy of the school when I graduated. And to date, consider Lahore as my hometown.
Okay, interesting. Your school also was very famous for cricketers, including your previous Prime Minister Imran Khan and the Raja brothers. Did you play a lot of sports?
I was very fond, as I think 99% of Pakistanis are, of cricket. I also got into squash, a sport that I continued at college and then in graduate school, and then also used to play tennis.
Okay.
So after I completed my A-levels at Aitchison, I applied for colleges both in the US as well as in England. Because I was in a British school, the headmaster of my school always used to say that the only higher universities to go to are in the UK. But you know how young people are, they also want to try new things. So I applied to both the US and England. I was very lucky to get into good universities. I got into Cambridge, England, and at Harvard in the US, and decided to go to Harvard. And that started a tremendously enriching journey of 4 years. And after I graduated from Harvard, I joined the World Bank. While many of my classmates were looking for jobs in investment banks, I thought that the best possible job was to work as a research analyst for economists at the World Bank on a very exciting project that I can tell you about later if you're interested. And I worked at the World Bank for 2 years, Murtaza, and then I decided to go to graduate school at the University of California, Berkeley, because by that time I had decided that I wanted to make a commitment to becoming an economist. And in the US, you have to do a PhD in economics to become an economist. And I did my PhD at Berkeley. In between, I spent a year as a visiting scholar at the economics department at MIT. So I came back to Cambridge. My thesis advisor was doing a sabbatical there. And then when I went on the job market, I had a few offers, and in the end decided to join the IMF. And so joined the IMF in the year 2000 and was with the IMF until 2019 when the call came to do public service. And then I resigned from the IMF and went back to Pakistan to serve my country and lead our central bank.
And you mentioned about economics. What made you choose economics?
Well, very early on, Murtaza, I was fundamentally and very passionately attracted to the idea of using the scientific method to address social problems. And I found, and particularly this was in college, I found that economics really afforded that in a much more rigorous and comprehensive manner than any of the disciplines that I had been exposed to. So fundamentally, I was interested in addressing socio-economic problems, but in terms of how you address them, I thought that it is important to try to be scientific about it. And in economics, I found that very happy marriage, between the two. So that's what triggered my interest in economics. And the first class that I took at Harvard, I was fortunate to get a very, very good teacher, an economist called N. Gregory Mankiw. You would have heard of him.
I've had his textbook. I
was going to tell you a story about his textbook. So so this is, the year 1989, and he wrote a very, what's now a very, very famous textbook on macroeconomics. And I was in the class when he was doing the manuscript of it. So we as students got a photocopied manuscript that was bound together, how things are bound in that time. And the font was a Courier font. I don't know if people still remember the Courier font. And the diagrams were hand-drawn by N. Gregory Mankiw. So, I went through that, and he also used to ask students feedback. But the point I wanted to make was that he was absolutely a brilliant teacher. And in particular, macroeconomics is an area where, you deal with issues such as unemployment, such as inflation, things that really matter in people's lives. And I was fortunate to have him as a good teacher. And then, when I finished my bachelor's in economics and I graduated, and as I mentioned, while most of my classmates wanted to make big money on Wall Street, I was lucky to get a job as a research analyst with two other economists that really helped spur the passion for economics more in me. Now they've gone on to become even more famous than they were at that time. This was Bill Easterly at the World Bank, who then is at NYU, has written many books on development, such as The Quest for Growth, and Ross Levine, who was doing a lot of work at the intersection of financial sector issues and economic development and growth. I got to work with them as a research analyst, and they were running a project on national policies and long-run growth. What are the types of national policies that help support long-term growth? And, that experience working, partly as a practitioner also really helped me to, realize that what this field, that I was committed enough to this field to pursue a PhD in it.
Mm-hmm. Now, you were saying that you started off at Harvard and you spent a little bit of time at MIT, and then you went to Berkeley. These are at each end of the US coast called saltwater economies. The Chicago people are the freshwater guys. You were never incentivized to perhaps go to a freshwater school?
Murtaza, I think the journey of school and I think careers, in my experience, when I look back, is very sequential. One step leads to another. And if you sit back and try to reprogram things, maybe you would do some things a bit differently. For me, I came, if I mark the key steps or the key decisions I had to take, right? When I was graduating from college, instead of going to Wall Street, I decided to go to the World Bank. I did that because of my interest in economics. From the World Bank, once I decided that I do want to become a professional economist and I want to do a PhD, I was very interested back then in international economics. And at Berkeley, California, you had some of the best people there at that time. You had Barry Eichengreen, who is still there. You had Jeff Frankel, who has since moved to Harvard. You have Maury Opsfeld, who is still there. And I, thought that would be the, right place for me to pursue my interest in economics. So that's why I went to Berkeley. Now, if you think about the decisions I made after that, from Berkeley to joining the IMF, that too, as with everybody, you're making decisions based upon the opportunity set that you have. And for me at that stage, I was very undecided between teaching, becoming a professor, and joining an institution like the World Bank or the IMF. And my best academic offer at that stage was from the University of Cambridge in England, which was a very, very attractive place. The reason I chose the IMF at that stage was because I wanted to operate at the intersection of economics and more practical matters. If you remember, my interest still is in ultimately addressing socio-economic problems. And IMF has impact, and for that matter, World Bank, and for that matter, many other institutions as well. They have impact based upon what they recommend. And so for me, what was the key factor to decide to join the IMF was, number one, the ability to have impact. And number two, and on a smaller note, I should say that the IMF, to me, was a bit of a black box. The IMF over the years has made strides in transparency, but back then, we are talking of the year 2000, the IMF report would come out, it would just have these tables in it, but everything else was a black box, and it had so much impact in the world. You remember the Asian financial crisis in the late 90s? At that point, the IMF had also come under a lot of criticism. And I was curious. I was really curious, what is this organization? And what are the types of people inside it? And I thought that the only way to find that out is to actually join it.
Okay, so you joined the IMF, and then you progress within the IMF, and then you get appointed as the resident representative, is it to the Philippines?
Yes. At the beginning, I worked in the research department. I worked with Raghuram Rajan, who was the director of the research department. I also worked with Ken Rogoff, who succeeded Raghuram Rajan. And then I moved to the Asian department, and I worked on Thailand. And then from Thailand, I worked on the Philippines. And then I was assigned as a resident representative to the Philippines. And I lived in Manila for 3.5 years.
What period was this?
This was from the summer of 2005 until the beginning of 2009.
So, Philippines is an interesting case study, especially for Sri Lanka, when you consider the economic issues that we are facing. I mean, it used to be called the sick child of Asia, and they had a dramatic turnaround. Were you privy to what happened?
Yeah, I was really fortunate actually, Murtaza, to have been able to witness the turnaround that happened because in 2005, when I was assigned to be the IMF's resident representative to the Philippines, at that point, the IMF was concerned only about two emerging markets in East Asia. One was Philippines, one was Indonesia. And in both cases, the IMF was in fact ready that they would get a call for a request for a program from the authorities. And when I reached the Philippines, it was appearing that things were going to be okay because there was an economic team led by a very good finance minister. But 2 weeks into my stay there, that finance minister resigned. And not only did he resign, he also resigned together with about 10 other cabinet members because they thought that the economic reform momentum or the commitment of the then president was not what it should be towards resolving the economic problems. This became known as the Hyatt 10 or the Hyatt 11 incident, where these 10 or 11 cabinet members got together in the Hyatt Hotel to give a press conference to announce their resignation. This happens in our countries. These are emerging markets. Many of the emerging markets, like Philippines, like Pakistan, are noisy democracies, But what happened was that it was a complete setback. And suddenly, things began to go haywire. Now, what kept Philippines anchored? That despite this political drama, that it managed to actually pull together a very good economic reform program, and in fact, never went to the IMF. Even though the IMF was ready, I was ready. I would always get calls from headquarters that we may get the request for a program anytime. And to me, what really struck me was that a group of Filipino economists came together and they wrote a white paper on the fiscal crisis facing the Philippines. And this is some of the most well-known names, some professors, some economists from think tanks, but all of them non-partisan, not affiliated with any of the political parties. And they put out this paper, and they also did a lot of advocacy in the public domain as well as with the government. And about 80% of the content of the recommendations of this paper, Murtaza, were the same as what the IMF has been saying. In fact, in many countries where crises take place in emerging markets, it's often because sensible and fairly commonsensical things have been delayed, not that the problem is rocket science, that it needs rocket science to solve, but just the actions have been delayed. Now, in the Philippines, this group came together, it made recommendations. As I mentioned, a lot of them were very similar. But because, Murtaza, these recommendations came from a group of Filipino economists, there was ownership in this, number one. And number two, it was a lot easier for the president of the Philippines to get behind a Filipino reform agenda than behind the IMF dictates, as I'm sure you're very familiar with the dialogue that happens in many countries that we are familiar with. Now, that, in my view, was the turnaround because the president decided to back it. It was things like broadening the base of the value-added tax. It was things such as increasing the rate of the value-added tax. It was reforms of the state-owned enterprises. Fiscal issues, state-owned enterprise issues, classic bread and butter issues of economics. Lo and behold, the president decided to do it. And I was there, Murtaza, when, in fact, the key the key litmus test was this reform called the EVAT, the Enhanced Value Added Tax, when they were going to raise the rate and extend it to petroleum products. There was so much uncertainty, Murtaza, that whether they would do it or not, it was a cliffhanger, like it is in our countries when important decisions have to be made and the president is concerned that she may lose power. That morning when it was supposed to be in effect, I myself drove the car to the nearest petrol pump to fill the car, to get a receipt, and to see if indeed the value-added tax had been imposed on petroleum product. That was the level of uncertainty. Look, they did this, and I saw the turnaround starting from the summer of 2005. They had so much foreign exchange coming in. The central bank didn't know what to do with it. It was buying, it was sterilizing, but never had they seen so much foreign exchange coming in. And this was a country, Murtaza, this was a country, when I first went, people were so pessimistic about it. I remember one investment banker telling me that, oh, you've come to the right country as a representative of the IMF, because this is a country that knows how to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. And the turnaround then was so striking that a year and a half later, so this is summer of 2005, roll the clock forward. It is December of 2006. And in Philippines, Christmas celebrations start very early. They call them they start from September. Christmas carols start in the streets, the Burr months, as they call them, September, October, November, December. And in the thick of December, nobody is actually doing any work. And it was the 23rd of December. And it was holidays. I was playing golf. My phone rings, I think on the 6th or the 7th green. It is Deputy Governor of the Central Bank. Pleasantries. And then he says, Reza, we were in a meeting with the president last night, and she has decided to give a Christmas gift to the country. And she has decided that the Philippines is going to prepay all of the IMF obligations in one go. I'm now not talking about deciding we're not going to borrow from the IMF in the future. This is a country that a year and a half ago, the IMF is very, very worried about a crisis. This is a country that goes from that stage to a year and a half, feeling that it has the reserves and the confidence to prepay all outstanding IMF obligations in one go. The Philippines president goes on national TV on Christmas Eve and delivers that message to the Filipino people. And in these countries, often given the image of the IMF, what a message of sovereignty that is coming from the head of state, that, our country is no longer not only dependent on IMF, we have prepaid all. The Deputy Governor called me to make sure that the payment happened before the 25th of December, because it was a large amount. And they wanted to make sure that the president can say that credibly. It's a real lesson, Mirza. It's a real lesson that in countries where they can themselves have, talented people, and I'm firmly convinced there's no shortage of talented people. There's no shortage of talented people in Pakistan, in Sri Lanka, in many other countries. But the question is a collective action problem. It's a coordination failure. In some countries, it happens, and we have to figure out how to make that happen. Philippines, since then, has never once gone back to the IMF.
I believe it was President Aquino, right, who was the leader at that time?
It was President Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo.
Okay. So what was the political environment at that time that enabled the president to do this?
It was a very charged political environment. And she had very, very vocal opponents and critics. And the reason her previous finance minister had resigned and the Hyatt 10 incident had occurred was because they felt that perhaps the commitment to the reforms was not there because of the political consequences that the reforms would have. But in my view, the turning point that enabled all of this was she was getting behind a Filipino reform program at the end of the day. She was not getting behind an IMF. Remember, there was no IMF program in 2005. We were ready. We never got the call. And Philippines delivered.
So obviously started by stabilizing the macro, But what were the type of structural reforms and microeconomic reforms that they enacted that allowed even growth to pick up?
The most important thing was fiscal. And over the previous years, Philippines had been running sustained deficits. And given the history as well, because Philippines at that point, Murtaza, was considered a prolonged user of IMF resources. This is a technical term that the IMF's Independent Evaluation Office had invented, in fact, had done a whole report on the prolonged users of IMF resources, in which Pakistan was there as well. And Philippines, if you read the report, you see that even its previous crises were essentially fiscally dominated. In many of these countries, fiscal is the root of a number of problems. And what was needed here was credibility that the reform measure would address fiscal problems on a sustainable basis going forward. That's why, the value-added tax and putting it also on petroleum was very, very important, because it is first of all, it hits the rich a lot more than it hits the poor, just because their consumption of gasoline is a lot more. It does have an inflationary impact. Therefore, it is important to have a cash transfer scheme as well to protect the poor. But at the heart was fiscal. And then that gave them the breathing space to do some other structural reforms in other parts of the economy as well. But doing the enhanced value-added tax, the EVAT, had become a litmus test of the authorities' commitment to the macroeconomic reform program.
And it said that in countries where citizens pay more taxes, enjoy better governance. The fact that the VAT base was expanded and there was more tax collection, did you also notice that the accountability and the governance improved?
That would be harder to say, Murtaza. That would be a lot harder to say, because I think if you look at the tax administration side, i.e. the efficiency of collecting taxes for a given system of tax rates, I think there were lots of concerns back then. The Bureau of Tax Collections, probably had 3 or 4 heads change in my time there. And I was there for 3.5 years. And there continue to be problems, in the efficiency. There continue to be problems with corruption. There continue to be problems with misgovernance. So I think what Philippines delivered at that stage was credibility on the fiscal front. And if you do that, you take away from its root the problem or the fear of fiscal dominance. And then foreign investors come in because they see that this is a high quality measure that has been done to address the fiscal problem.
You mentioned about the VAT on petroleum. I believe Pakistan also has a problem of undertaxing fuel, and this has been a problem in Sri Lanka also. When you consider that in all these 3 countries that fuel is imported, why do we underprice or have tax subsidies or undertax essentially an imported item?
It's the billion-dollar question, Murtaza. I think that it is partly a product of the gains that existing stakeholders have from high consumption of fuel. I think it is partly also a product of having the willingness to take a difficult measure. But I have to say that once you do take the measure, people adjust, because people are rational and people respond to incentives and they respond to prices. People are in any given day doing expenditure switching. If you go to a grocery store, even if you're not conscious of it, you're doing it. If one type of food item is getting expensive, you are switching your expenditure to other types. Similarly, I think it is a transition to go through. It can be done. I think the fear is that, especially these days, Mirza, coming on the back of a lot of inflation, globally as well as domestically, then inflation particularly of food prices, and then over the last decade, the rise in income inequality that many people like Piketty and others have documented. I think the fear of a lot of political governments right now is that one small flare-up might lead to a massive uprising. You remember in Tunisia, and then you remember in some of the other Middle Eastern countries, and then recently in some other countries, it takes one incident where if you have a dry stack of hay, it's a flame, and then the social media is, the wind that blows the flames much more rapidly than it would otherwise. And I think it's that fear ultimately that keeps people back. What I don't understand, and maybe Advocata can do this in Sri Lanka, is, why don't media savvy think tanks or other advocacy groups come out? And because they are, in your case, Sri Lankan, in our case, Pakistani, because they are Pakistani, if they preach and if they document that such taxation is progressive, i.e., the burden is going to fall a lot more on the rich than then they will hopefully make more progress in getting that ownership. When politicians say it or somebody in office says it, many people, at least I'll speak for Pakistan, are suspicious. They think that the truth is something else. And so I have not understood why, domestic organizations do not come together for greater advocacy on this issue.
So, for your information, Advocata has been taking that stance, and a World Bank study has shown that 70% of the benefit of tax subsidies on energy is flowing to the top 30% of households. And interestingly, that I had another conversation with the Petroleum Secretary of India. It seems like, about 10 years ago, they have broken this addiction to give tax subsidies on fuel. So as you know, in India, the taxes are about now 30% of the retail price of fuel, while in Sri Lanka, it's at the moment hovering at about 16-17%. With the recent declines in international prices, there is now room for a significant increase in taxation without significantly reducing retail prices, and I hope the authorities would do that. If I can move on to your transition within the IMF to the emerging market department, what was that like? Can you share with us unique experiences?
Absolutely. You have to take your mind back now, Murtaza, to not the COVID crisis, not the current crisis we have, but the global financial crisis that started in 2008 and then really got going in 2009. And this was the time that I was finishing my assignment in the Philippines and going back to the headquarters. And it was a really, really exciting time because the world was on fire. Lehman Brothers had collapsed. The crisis had spread to emerging markets in Europe, many Eastern European countries. And there was panic around the world. Interestingly, and you may not remember this, but in the decade before the global financial crisis, the IMF was slowly going out of business. There were very few programs. There was only one large program, and that was Turkey. And probably Turkey single-handedly was paying the salaries or the administrative budget, was the single largest contributor probably to the administrative budget of the IMF at that stage. And there were many people who were thinking that is an IMF really going to be needed going forward? And it was because we had a very long period of abundant liquidity and no crises. If you look at the 2000s until, Lehman Brothers. So it was an exciting time to be in headquarters because the institution, in fact, the IMF laid off people. It laid off nearly about 20% of its employees through a voluntary scheme because there were not enough programs. It completed this separation right before the global financial crisis because it was under pressure from its board. that how, people, hindsight is 2020, people typically look in the rear view mirror and make forward-looking decisions. So the thinking back then was that because we had not had any crises and because we were in a new normal, that the IMF does not need as many people as it has, and therefore we should do a separation scheme. To go from that mindset into a complete turnaround was fascinating. And the emerging markets division was particularly exciting because this was in a department called Strategy, Policy and Review. We think of it as the police department of the IMF. No program can be done without the co-signature of the head of the SPR department. And it also is a department that has to ensure that country teams are being consistent with IMF policy and that it is being applied even-handedly across countries. So when a global financial crisis hits, the first question is, how is the IMF going to read to? How is the global community? Let me start with the bigger level. How is the global community going to help the countries that are burning? The then IMF managing director was a person called Dominique Strauss-Kahn. And he had a vision, and a brilliant vision at the time, which was that his goal was to convince important capitals that instead of going, i.e. big countries, instead of going bilaterally and helping the emerging markets or other countries that are getting into trouble, his message to the main capitals was that you should put money in the IMF. I, as a managing director, will reform the IMF because remember, there was still the baggage from the Asian financial crisis. And we will reform the IMF, and then your money will be a lot more effective than if all of the countries go bilaterally. And that vision and idea and the pitch essentially made the fund the $1 trillion fund, which it was not before. It was an exciting time because then with the arsenal of the IMF expanded so much, the Strategy, Policy Review Department and the Emerging Markets Division of the fund had to then also reform our policies. How will the fund become more flexible? How will it become more quick? And in particular, how will the fund also put behind it some of the stigma? So we created at that point a new lending instrument that had, I think, previously would not have been thinkable. And this was the flexible credit line. Think of this as the platinum credit card or whatever the highest level of the credit card is, where a country qualifies for the credit line based upon its credit history, not based upon any further conditions that it would have to meet. And this we created in the Emerging Markets Division. And it was opposed by some chairs, but supported by some other chairs. And the concept was not novel. It just needed a little bit of initiative, innovative thinking. And then big countries took it. Mexico took it. Colombia took it. Poland took it right on the eve of these crises. And the whole idea, thinking as an economist for a minute and using jargon, you would be familiar with the term multiple equilibrium. That in certain systems, you can have two stable equilibrium, a bad one and a good one. And you need to figure out a way, if you're in the bad equilibrium, to shift things to a good equilibrium. And often this means about changing expectations. The flexible credit line's goal was exactly that there are no more conditions to meet. These countries have a very good track record of prudent macroeconomic policy management. And by qualifying already for the credit line, the markets would know that this country has the backstop that is needed for it to not go under, and therefore it is not an advantageous trade to short the assets of this country. And you could draw down the flexible credit line by just one phone call. You did not need to meet any other condition.
And if
you look at
what was the size of these credit lines?
Tens of billions of dollars. I think Mexico was 20, 30, 40 billion dollars. Poland was another few tens of billions. Similarly, Colombia was very large as well. And more than that, the success was that the countries did not have to draw. the countries did not have to draw, at least in the earlier period. Then I moved on. And that was a success because, you wanted to basically give a signal with credibility, and that would pull back the crisis of confidence that was happening. So that was one. Another key learning for me back then was because I was very heavily involved in the programs that the IMF then did for a number of countries in Europe, many Eastern European countries. As you know, they had, in this previous period of low interest rates, credit booms had taken off, and there was a lot of lending, especially to mortgages. Then you would recall that advanced economies began to fall in Europe. There was Greece, there was Ireland, there was Portugal. I went to negotiate. The Portugal mission acted as the deputy to the person who was in charge from the IMF side. Now, a key learning for me when I looked at the experiences of all of those countries was that emerging markets in Europe that had flexible exchange rates did better than those that had fixed exchange rates. And it served to me, I think, one of the lessons that I've held close, since. It's an issue, as you know, in the Sri Lanka program as well, was a case in the Pakistan program as well. I had to float the Pakistani rupee when I had joined the Central Bank of Pakistan. But, I saw that up close, that the recessions that started and the busts that took place were a lot deeper in countries with a fixed exchange rate, like Latvia and others, than those which had a flexible exchange rate like Poland and others. And even you don't need to look at emerging markets, look at advanced economies. Sweden handles the global financial crisis and the turmoil in Europe a lot better than many of the other countries with a fixed exchange rate. So I wanted to make 2 points, Murtaza. One, how the institution really went from being considered, about to fade into oblivion as the sunset had come to the IMF, to one that fully gets into the seat on the horse when you're riding a horse. It fully comes into the saddle, and then also reforms itself by improving its conditionality, coming up with new ways to lend. And I wanted to share a personal learning that I had regarding, exchange rates.
And then you moved on to the debt department, right? Did you move into the debt department after the GFC or before the GFC?
Right after the GFC, the debt department is also in the strategy, policy and review department because it sets the IMF's policies with regards to debt restructuring, debt sustainability, and a whole host of areas. And I moved from being a deputy division chief in the emerging markets to becoming a division chief of the debt policy department.
Right. And what does the debt policy department do, and what did you have to do?
So the debt policy division of the IMF is in charge. It's the custodian of IMF's policies with regards to sovereign debt restructuring, debt sustainability. There is another policy called debt limits, and all the issues related to sovereign debt. And it gets involved from a policy perspective because in the IMF, there are 2 key perspectives. There's the policy department and there is the legal department. Whenever you're trying to change the way the IMF is working, you need 2 important departments, SPR and legal. And that's why many people often say that the heads of these 2 departments are often considered the most important heads in the institution. Now, what does this mean more specifically? What this means is that if a country, for instance, is considering sovereign debt restructuring, the debt policy division would be involved from the very beginning. The debt policy division also is the custodian of the debt sustainability analysis. So the methodology for how a DSA is done, whether for low-income countries or for middle, is done in that division. This division also does the review, so that if a country team working on Sri Lanka proposes a debt restructuring that produces a particular path of main debt indicators, gross financing needs, debt to GDP, others, the economists in this division will have to review and themselves give an independent perspective that yes, in their view, this does meet the debt sustainability criteria, because as you can imagine, many times mission chiefs and country teams, for a variety of circumstances, can have a keenness to just move forward, especially if things are getting delayed or they feel they get close to the country authorities. So this division has to be the enforcer of the rules and the even-handedness of the application of the DSA across countries.
And I believe that during the time, I don't know whether you were in that department around about 2014, where a very large program was done for Ukraine. And there was some dispensation given to Ukraine that is normally not given. Can you explain to us what that was about?
Well, can I take a step back, maybe, instead
Right.
of talking individual country cases, talk a little bit about, what happened in the debt policy division during that era, because there were many changes that happened.
Okay.
In that time. Just before moving on from Ukraine, the only comment I'll make on the debt restructuring was that after the debt restructuring, there was some criticism by some quarters that there was some money left on the table, i.e., one of the funds was quite largely invested, and perhaps there could have been a deeper debt reduction as well. But these are always questions that also come up. But let me actually, if I can, address something about a transformation that occurred during those periods. So sovereign debt restructuring is a topic, Murtaza, that used to be discussed quite often in the IMF. But then it stopped. And one of the most exciting things that happened during my time leading the debt policy division was that we put together, working with the head of the legal department, we put on the agenda of the board of the IMF a work program to change the IMF's policies regarding sovereign debt restructuring. And then we nearly successfully completed it. The arrears policy, the arrears to official creditors, was part of that agenda. Now, it was exciting, Mirza, because for a number of years, the IMF and the board had not looked at sovereign debt issues. And one of the key reasons why was, you may remember, well before this period, the IMF had tried to propose a debt restructuring mechanism called the SDRM. Anne Krieger, the then deputy managing director, was very keen that the countries have an orderly way of debt restructuring. Staff was behind that. It went all the way to the board with a great deal of momentum. But the board killed it because there were divisions in the board. And that experience was one that staff of the IMF never forgot. And what happened was that on topics of sovereign debt restructuring, people began to internalize board's divisions. And therefore, there was a tendency to not take controversial issues about sovereign debt restructuring back to the board. In this time period that we're talking about, after the global financial crisis and then the Euro area programs, at that time, there was also a court case going on in New York about Argentina. And there was a New York judge, Judge Reza, if I remember the name correctly. And that was also causing a lot of discomfort in the international markets about the ability to restructure sovereign debt. It was a case that involved some holdouts. Then you had the Greece debt restructuring. And myself, a few other colleagues were at that time, staff of the IMF, were pushing that we need to take a paper to the board, even though there are divisions, but we need to put back on the agenda of the board some work that the IMF needs to do to reform its policies with regards to sovereign debt restructuring. Now, what we didn't also want to do is, given that these issues are controversial at the board, we did not want to jump the gun. We just didn't want to go with the paper that laid out the problems and proposed the solutions. We wanted to get ownership of the board. And we thought the better way to do that, and the reason I'm walking you through this is because in case for anybody else it's useful, what's a good way to change IMF policies? we decided that we would take to the board a review of the fund's experience in sovereign debt restructuring and propose a 4-pronged work program for the board's consideration, that it allows or endorses the staff to study these areas more and then bring policy recommendations in each of these areas for the board's consideration. Structuring it in this way by starting a work program, then simply jumping the gun, proved to be very, very important because it developed ownership on the part of the board. And these 4 areas were, number 1, the fund's lending policies, in particular the exceptional access framework, which had been bent for the program for Greece in particular, and there was a lot of discomfort about that was no longer the right framework. So the fund's lending policies. Number 2 was contractual provisions in sovereign bond contracts, and in particular collective action clauses needed some reform because you could have holdouts in individual series, but what you really wanted was aggregation across collective action clauses, so you could wash out any holdout in an individual series. And there were many other areas as well. The third, so this second point was more markets and legal issues driven. The third was the arrears policy. And we can talk about that. The fund already had a lending into arrears policy for private creditors. Staff had previously tried to do a similar policy for official creditors, had not succeeded. And we proposed that this should now be reconsidered, and there is time to consider a similar policy for tolerating arrears towards official creditors. And the last program was the issues of process, i.e., there was not too much clarity about what are the fund's expectations on the good faith criteria. How is the debtor supposed to make representations to the creditor? What information should be shared? What is not shared? And then related issues also, such as the perimeter of sovereign debt as well. So those 4 years that I was at the debt policy division, one of the most satisfying areas for me was, in addition to the countries that I worked on the debt restructuring in Greece, on the one in Ukraine, there was Jamaica back then as well, a few others. At that time, Myanmar got a Paris Club deal as well. In addition to all of the country cases, I think this policy work program and the changes that we did was extremely exciting, and those changes are still there. In addition, we also revised the methodology of the DSA. There was a new methodology both for the low-income country DSA as well as for the market access country DSA as well. So sorry to take some time, but I wanted to tell you that those 4 years were years when the fund's engagement on sovereign debt issues really rose.
So am I correct in assuming that the work that you all did at that time in developing a methodology probably is the methodology that the IMF is applying in their analysis with Sri Lanka?
Yes, Sri Lanka, I believe, is a market access country as opposed to a low-income country, and therefore it uses the market access DSA, which is a different framework. And in my time, we did a comprehensive update of that framework. These frameworks are reviewed every few years, and I think since I left, remember we are talking of 2011, 12, 13, 14. This framework was again reviewed recently, and then further improvements have been made in it as well.
And you mentioned about the collective action clauses. So now most bond issuances will have the double limb, that it's not only the series, but it's also the cumulative votes, right, across all bonds.
Yeah, and again, I think the process is important, Murtaza, because what we had wanted was that there be good engagement between all the relevant stakeholders, because this is actually not the IMF's call. The IMF can't go and recommend and tell countries you should issue sovereign bonds with these clauses, right? So it had to be a participatory process. And actually, the U.S. Treasury, and Mark Zobel in particular, who was then in the U.S. Treasury, played a very, very active role in this and created a working group of relevant stakeholders that met periodically, lawyers, IMF officials, others, that put forward proposals. And then it led to ICMA, the International Capital Markets Association, producing a standard clause or clauses for aggregated collective action clauses. And then once ICMA did it, and then the IMF board endorsed it, that this was a good way to move forward, then, on a flow basis, countries were encouraged to use these clauses in their bond issuances.
Briefly then, can you tell us about the lending in arrears program? What exactly is that?
So for your viewers, I'll just give a backdrop into the concept of lending into arrears. And historically, the fund's policy was that it did not allow member countries to run arrears to external creditors in a period when the member was making use of the IMF's resources. And the reason for this was that the IMF believed, for good reason, that running arrears is not a good way for a member to address its balance of payments problems, and in particular, running arrears to address balance of payments problems would be detrimental to the international monetary system. Just think about it. If everybody began to run arrears, the international monetary system would not function. So while this traditional historical perspective had merits in it, there came a time when emerging markets, and I believe, if I'm getting my dates right, in the 80s, ran into a number of crises. The IMF began to notice that some private creditors began to play the role of a holdout creditor. In other words, because they knew that the IMF cannot lend if a country is running arrears to one of the external creditors, even if it's a private creditor, they had a lot of leverage, i.e., that if they did not agree to the terms that were being offered by the member country, they essentially had a veto over IMF lending. So that undermined another key goal of the IMF, which is to provide timely and adequate temporary use of its resources to member countries facing sharp balance of payments crises. And therefore, the fund looked at the issue of, in certain circumstances, allowing the fund to lend to a country that may be running arrears to external creditors, so long as that member country was making efforts in good faith to negotiate with that private creditor a debt restructuring that would be consistent with the goals of the IMF program. That was the concept. Now, when this was originally being discussed and being taken to the board, Murtaza and I, did a lot of research in this, because when we started the four-pronged research program in the IMF for, revisiting sovereign debt policies, one of the jobs was also to revisit and research all the work that had been done by the IMF before. We also saw that actually, even back at that time, staff had thought that in a similar vein, the same policy should apply towards official creditors, because it was conceivable, though at that stage such incidents had not occurred, but it was conceivable that a bilateral official creditor may also be able to delay the provision of IMF resources to a member country because of its de facto veto. What happened was only the policy towards private creditors was adopted, and that essentially ended the veto that private creditors had over fund lending. When we wrote this paper, we were again concerned about the potential of IMF being delayed in providing assistance from from the bilateral creditor space. And essentially at its heart, though, you must understand, this issue is about shifting some power from capitals, the major capitals of the world, to the board of the IMF. That's essentially what is at the heart of this issue, if you think about it. Because in one way, that decision is decentralized in the capitals. And in the other way, the way policy is, it would be centralized in the board of the IMF. I think that circumstances, and in particular, after, I think, Russia's invasion of Crimea, there was a case that came up, which was a 3 billion bond that Ukraine had issued and was placed with Russia. And the IMF had wanted to lend to Ukraine. But if Russia claimed that it was not being repaid and Ukraine was running arrears to it, then the IMF could not lend. There were some other considerations as well, but the appetite at that stage developed in the board that they should look at this issue, as staff had been saying. And therefore, this policy, I wrote it together with Sean Hagan, as well as a couple of other colleagues, worked on it. It came out from the debt policy division. It was the last policy paper that I led before moving from the debt policy division to the European department and then to Egypt. And Egypt then was my last assignment. But that hopefully gives you a little bit of background of the arrears policy. I should tell you that although those geopolitical situation made it possible or helped to take it forward, the idea was conceived much earlier when we wrote the 2013 paper, the paper that laid out the roadmap for the fund to work on sovereign debt restructuring. By the way, that paper became known, that paper got a nickname because in that paper we said that the review of experience had shown that debt restructurings had been too little too late. And that paper became known as the too little too late paper. So what I'm saying is when we wrote that paper in 2013, we had not anticipated the Russia-Ukraine issue, i.e. that proposal was there to begin with. That proposal didn't come about because of geopolitical events, but geopolitical events allowed, develop the, openness in the board to consider the merits of the idea, and the merits stood on their own.
So I believe today is the eve of a potential IMF program, 17th IMF program to Sri Lanka. Now that we have got financial assurances from our bilateral creditors, including China, and we have done a cessation of payments on our private creditors, is the IMF lending to Sri Lanka, lending under arrears?
Well, I think we should wait and see for the board meeting. And I have not been as much in contact with the Sri Lankan authorities about the state of play. But we should wait and see, the announcements that come after the board meeting. But I would just say, Murtaza, that Sri Lanka is not alone right now. It just is unfortunate that many of these issues are being worked out in this live case. And I'm also very convinced that the staff of the IMF, if I talk to people in SPR, if I talk to people in the Asia and Pacific department, they are very, very keen. They are very, very keen that we do not, that the world and they do not rest easy with a system where it takes a year after a country has defaulted to come to the board for the approval of the program. And remember, this is just the board, right? The actual debt restructuring will have to happen after the approval of the program.
So if we now move on to your country, Pakistan, you were appointed the governor of the Central Bank of Pakistan. Can you tell us a little bit about how you got that appointment?
Well, Murtaza, I got that assignment, as I mentioned to you, when I was the IMF's senior resident representative in Egypt. And I had moved with my family in 2017, and I had moved at a very exciting time because this was the loan program that Egypt had was coming after decades. Egypt had not come to the IMF in decades, maybe 2 or 3 decades. And at that time, this was the largest loan that the IMF was giving to any Middle Eastern country. In the Middle Eastern department, largest, so very high profile loan. IMF did not have an office in Egypt. It used to have one, but it was shut down. And so I went there to open up an office. There was no home and there was no office when I went with my family. If you look now, there's a thriving IMF office. There's been 2 or 3 programs since, and there's a program there, right now as well. Very exciting time. Now, initially, my first year there was very hard because, as you know, in the first year of an IMF program, and largely because important decisions have been delayed, largely because, the decisions that a member country had to take, it delayed, the actions that have to be taken are painful. And so the first year is painful. Interest rates are high. The exchange rate had been devalued. Inflation was running at 30%. And wherever I would go, people would blame the IMF. What are you guys doing? You are going to destroy the country. You must be familiar with that. And it was tough, but the authorities persevered and they never delayed the completion of a review. They were very committed. And within a year, the turnaround began to happen. And the same people, Murtaza, who previously used to criticize and attack me, then began to really welcome the supporting role that the IMF had played in the turnaround of the Egyptian economy. So I was in my second year in Cairo, very much enjoying now because, we had, it was a good story, good relations with the authorities when the call came. And, when these things happen, if it's public service, and to me, the value of public service had always been a very, very important value that my parents had always inculcated in me, that I had always espoused very dearly. And if you remember when I spoke about my interest in economics and the fact that it is ultimately socio-economic problems that, are the biggest challenges, and economics is yet one tool, I thought that, this was a tremendous opportunity and a great honor. So I left Cairo. I resigned from the IMF and I joined the State Bank of Pakistan. This was early May. And it was in the midst of complete chaos. I mean, right now there is chaos in Pakistan, but everything is relative and people forget. We went to move from one chaos to another. But back there, May of 2019, it was complete chaos. Markets were melting. And the main concern was that there was no IMF program that was being negotiated, and it was not clear why. And so the role that had been assigned to the finance minister, who was new, and to me, was to negotiate an IMF program and to restore market sentiment. And that was the first thing that we did. It was not easy at all, Murtaza. It was not easy at all because the IMF, because it was, I think, then the 22nd or the 23rd program for Pakistan. This is slightly overstating because it also includes back-to-back programs when you cancel one, but immediately are starting the new program, but it's the same macroeconomic reform program. But still, if the number of programs is in double digits, it's quite a lot of programs. Because of the number of programs, the IMF also wanted a number of prior actions, as opposed to doing measures along the way, because they were concerned about there may be political changes, political developments. And so one of the things was, and this, came squarely on me, on my shoulders, was we had to float the rupee. And we had to float the rupee not from a position of strength, but rather when reserves were very small. And, it was only when I joined the State Bank of Pakistan and that I got the briefing on both the quantity and the quality of the reserves that I realized the magnitude of the difficulty of the task, because it is easy, and it is only when I went and began to sit on the other side of the table from the IMF that I realized that it is easy to be prescriptive and to say that float the rupee, but when you're on the other side and you feel that the circumstances, you wish you had twice as many reserves to give more credibility, then you realize that, look, you don't know at the end of the day what would happen, because asset prices like exchange rates, are driven partly by fundamentals, but partly also by market forces, by market sentiments, by animal spirits. And you do not know where the exchange rate would end up. And I personally had been involved in many countries, Murtaza, whereas the IMF, I knew firsthand, the IMF had said, well, we should floor the rupee. We think the exchange rate will go from X to 2X. It ends up going 3X or 4X. Okay. Personally, I knew of situations they're not spoken about much. But so, the biggest concern in a situation like this is that, notwithstanding your analysis of real equilibrium exchange rates, you don't know if it will actually stop falling or not. And so it was a difficult time. But we floated the rupee. And I remember we took it up in stages because it was probably, we thought, going to be too disruptive if suddenly it devalued by a very large amount. And then when we finally let it go, after some initial volatility, it actually began to strengthen. And from the period from about August of 2019, we negotiated, program started July, 1st July roughly 2019. From about August of 2019 until COVID comes in March of 2020, the rupee actually strengthened, and it strengthened at a time when the State Bank of Pakistan was also building reserves. And to me, there were some lessons. And the most important lesson was that a flotation of an exchange rate in a country like Pakistan, which are complicated emerging markets with a history of IMF programs and a history of credibility problems, you need the flotation to come as part of a coordinated set of actions. And what are those? First, we spoke about fiscal. You have to convey credibly that fiscal policy is changing directions. And at that point, there was a finance minister who was very well regarded for his fiscal prudence. And I think that was an important...
Who was the finance minister?
It was Hafiz Sheikh.
I have met him a few times.
And in fact, the Prime Minister, Imran Khan, had just a few weeks before I was appointed, changed his economic team and had brought in Hafiz Sheikh. And one of the reasons that had been given was to help negotiate the IMF program. But the point I want to make is broader, which is, one, you need credibility that fiscal is moving in the right direction. Number two, you have to have a credible story for the international community, and for Pakistan, it was in the form of an IMF program. So that people at the end of the day feel that the exchange rate flotation is coming as part of an overall package. And in circumstances, if you don't have these other, supporting factors, I think it would be a lot harder to do an exchange rate flotation.
You got appointed under the government of Imran Khan. I believe he didn't have a large majority. Was there political commitment to do all the necessary reform prior to COVID?
So look, the IMF program that was done, and we completed, 6 successful reviews of it. And even during COVID, we remained in a very good and constructive dialogue with the IMF as well. And I should point out that Pakistan's journey during COVID was one which was very striking, because it is one of the few countries in the world that actually reduces its debt to GDP ratio by about 5 percentage points of GDP through COVID. Very few countries did that, while at the same time also having a good rebound in growth, at the same time also reducing the primary deficit. Now, Pakistan's start of the IMF reform program, even though it was difficult measures and generated a lot of criticism of the then government, the start was very good. Stock market began to rise. Bloomberg called Pakistan's stock market one of the best performing in 2019. This is after, it had previously been extremely bearish on Pakistan. As I mentioned, the exchange rate was actually strengthening. Reserves were being built while the exchange rate was strengthening, and just the general sentiment suddenly was improving, despite all the painful reform. Then came COVID. COVID would have been the classic. Pakistan could have become the poster child for a disaster in COVID, because congested living spaces, poor health facilities, and so forth. Yet, across a dimension of factors, whether it is the positivity ratio from PCR cases, whether it's the number of COVID cases per capita, Pakistan does very well. Pakistan also, rolled out one of the largest schemes for cash transfers. And then on the fiscal and monetary side, bringing down public debt while having, the COVID crisis. So all throughout that period, there was a very, I think, a deft handling, but also a productive relationship with the IMF as well. Like with any IMF program, there are areas that you negotiate and that you need to do. And it's a time-honored tradition that you argue passionately for where you think the IMF may not be understanding the ground realities. But as in many other things, Murtaza, it's at the end of the day, you make a compromise and you make a friendly handshake, and then you move on.
So whilst you were there as the central bank governor, I believe you brought in a new law. Was the central bank law under your tenure? And what were some of the elements of the new law?
Absolutely. So it was in my time that we developed and we put up to Parliament, and we got approved from Parliament a law to strengthen the independence of the central bank. And by we, I mean the government of Pakistan, because it is the government of Pakistan that proposes legislation. Now, this law, served to do a few things. A few probably things that were already being done on a de facto basis, but had to be enshrined because there had been a particular burn of contention between the IMF and the Pakistani authorities in the past. One of them had to do with central bank lending to the government. And in many previous programs, this repeatedly became an issue where the government would commit to stop borrowing, but it would end up finding some ways around it. And from the 31st of June of 2019, the government of Pakistan did not borrow a single rupee from the State Bank of Pakistan. It was also enshrined in the law, and this was one of the key provisions of the law, was to prohibit the lending by the central bank to the government, for obvious reasons that I think you understand well. Other important changes were to define the objectives, the goals of the central bank, because previously they were not very clearly defined, and now it's clear that price stability, financial stability, and supporting growth are the three goals of the central bank, in that order as well, if there are trade-offs. Then there was institutional autonomy, i.e. once the goals of an institution are set. Independence doesn't mean that a central bank decides its own goals. The goals have to be set by the owner of the institution, which is the government. But then the institution needs institutional independence to be able to execute on that mandate. And then there was accountability. And the important changes were made for how the central bank would present to the parliament and to the country its own assessment of the extent to which it had made progress in achieving those goals. Now, this law, it is fair to say, was seen with a lot of suspicion in Pakistan. And I think it stems in large part from the image problem that the IMF has. And in fact, I have rarely been in a country where the IMF has a bigger image problem than in Pakistan, because either it is particular interest groups that benefit from it, or it is because IMF itself does not invest enough in its outreach. But generally, people have a very suspicious frame of thinking about the IMF. And when, it was also clear that the revision of the law was one of the IMF conditions as well, that was also being looked at with a lot of suspicion. And I think it would have been good if more effort had been made into developing ownership of the changes that are to be done in the law. Because if you don't do that, and if you don't spend, say, a year just doing that, then, you may have de jure independence, but you may not have de facto independence. So, changing the law was important. It was a big step forward. It was done as part of the IMF program, but it doesn't stop there. I think what is important is that people should understand why is it important to have independence defined in this way, that the goals are set by the government, but the institution has some autonomy in the pursuit of those goals.
So the governance structure under the new law, you have do you have two boards? Do you have a monetary policy board and a governing board, or you have a single board?
There's a single board. There is already was a committee called the Monetary Policy Committee of the board that comprised of some of the board members, some from outside, and some senior officials from within the central bank.
So, and how are these appointments made to the board?
These appointments are made by the government. And the government now, under interpretation of the courts, is a decision of the federal cabinet. And based upon that decision, I believe once the cabinet has approved, the prime minister makes a recommendation, and the formal appointment is done by the president.
Okay. And what are the tenure of these appointments? 5
years. It used to be 3 years, and then everything was standardized to 5 years.
And during your period, you would have been set an inflation target. Was that about 5 to 7%?
So Pakistan does not have a formal inflation targeting framework. We actually encourage the government to include in its budget statement a medium-term inflation goal. And that is what people refer to. And the central bank also in its monetary policy committee statements would refer to the goal of the government of having inflation in this range. But in a country like Pakistan, where quarterly GDP data is not available, high-frequency fiscal data is not available, and many other indicators of economic activity and prices are not available very readily, it is very difficult to move towards full-fledged inflation targeting.
I was surprised to read that in preparation for this interview, I read your Article 4 report, and I found that you don't prepare quarterly GDP estimates. Why not?
It is a very good question for our bureau. of statistics.
Okay.
Trust me, as a central banker, I would have very much wanted. And there was progress being made, but it is one of those things.
Okay. Although you said that the term of office was 5 years, you didn't probably serve your entire term. How come you left early?
I did, Murtaza, because 5 years was in the new law. In the previous law, it was 3 years.
Okay.
So I was appointed for a term of 3 years, and I completed my term.
You decided to leave, or you were not reappointed?
So it was a month and a half before the end of my term. There was a vote of no confidence.
Okay.
And then there was a change in government. And then the decision of the appointment is the decision of the government. That was in the old law, and that is also in the new law, and that's how it should be.
So very quickly, I mean, Pakistan is also facing huge challenges, including large amount of external debt. Unlike in Sri Lanka, my understanding is the external debt is mainly to bilateral creditors, right? Would that be restructured? Are you confident that it will be restructured?
So a lot of the external debt is to official creditors. That includes both multilaterals as well as bilaterals, Murtaza. And both are significant amounts. The external debt owed to private creditors, especially bondholders, is very, very small. As you know, and as has been discussed at length in various fora, the landscape for bilateral official creditor coordination is now a lot more difficult because many of these countries are not in any fora where they can coordinate. And Pakistan in particular, with large amounts of obligations to China, to countries in the Middle East, as well as, to many Paris Club countries as well, I think will demonstrates, the new and very changed creditor landscape.
So during your time as the governor, did you take any steps to improve financial inclusion?
So if this financial inclusion was one of the most exciting areas, Murtaza, that I worked on. And if we did not have an IMF program, there was so much more that I would have wanted to give my time to in the financial inclusion agenda. My starting point was the observation that the commercial banks of Pakistan were not doing enough for the goal of raising inclusion. And so for me, some of the most exciting things that I worked on was in this area. And I want to give you some examples. We launched a program called Roshan Digital Account for overseas Pakistanis, which allowed overseas Pakistanis, of which there are several million, 6 to 7 million, to be digitally onboarded in the commercial banks of Pakistan, which means that they can remotely create an account and then they can bank for lifestyle banking purposes, but they can also invest in retail savings certificates that are offered through these Roshan Digital accounts. We launched it during COVID. It was a way to promote the inclusion of overseas Pakistanis into Pakistan's bank system. Launched it in September of 2020. To date, it has clocked $5.8 billion of gross inflows into the country, which were not there before, just by making it easy. Can separately tell you more about it. We launched a dedicated policy to promote the financial inclusion for women. I think we were one of the only central banks in the world that has a mandate policy called Banking on Equality that sets certain goals for its regulated institutions for how they have to better cater towards financial inclusion of women. We launched RAST, which is Pakistan's first faster payment system. And the faster payment system is a technical term, not RTGS, but like the ones in Singapore and in Australia and in Canada, where the credit is made within seconds after the debit. And we used people's cell phone numbers as the alias, so that people don't even need to give their bank account numbers. Just knowing your cell phone number, I can pull out my smartphone go into the Rast app and send money. It was again an initiative that was geared towards promoting inclusion. And probably the area that I was most excited about was, Murtaza, a program for affordable mortgages for houses that were not larger than a certain size. And I mean a really small size. And in Pakistan, banks have not been providing mortgages to rich people, to middle class people, let alone to people who are not well off. And we started a new program whereby for houses that were less than 125 square yards or apartments. And so this is very small. This is like a small space, and typically for a family of four. That the government would cover a certain difference in the interest expense. So it would lock the interest at 5% for the smaller ones, 7% at most, such that the monthly payment would come to be the same as the typical rent that a person was paying. The credit approvals were going to be done by the banks, by the commercial banks, not by the central bank. But what we needed was to get the commercial banks to source customers and to develop their decision-making tools to consider the applications of such customers. I myself chaired 50 meetings of the steering committee to get banks to be offering this product. And I'm very happy to say that by the time that my term had ended, we had commercial banks of Pakistan had approved $1 billion of such mortgages for low-income families. And this was well targeted because we know that rich people don't like to live in small places. So I started off by saying that this was the most exciting part of the work that I got to do. And we made great strides, but it also showed me how much more there is to be done on the side of inclusion.
So those initiatives that you kind of initiated, are they still ongoing? Are they growing?
So the Roshan Digital Account Initiative is still very much there. The initiative Rast is very much there. I didn't mention to you, I also launched a licensing framework for digital banks, i.e. we invited applications for digital banks, which are non-brick and mortar banks. So we launched that framework and we invited interest. That is still going. And in fact, the State Bank has awarded 5 licenses. Rast, the faster payment system, is still going. The affordable mortgages program, there has been less momentum on that because of the very sharp rise in interest rates, and therefore a larger required subsidy on the part of the government to make that program work.
Last year, I had the pleasure of having a conversation, it was a live conversation with the former governor of the Bank of Thailand, Dr. Virata. And he said that, to handle the stress of being a central bank, he practices Vipassana meditation. What did you do to handle the stress of being the governor of the Central Bank of Pakistan?
Well, I have to say, Murtaza, that the initial several months were very difficult because of the crisis in the summer of 2019 that Pakistan faced. The goal of putting an IMF program together, and then also to seeing that the program works, because I had, after nearly 20 years at the IMF, also seen many programs where the program did not work. For instance, look what happened in Greece, look what happened in Thailand, look what happened in Argentina, many big examples. It took several months for me to develop that degree of comfort that yes, we were looking at the abyss back then, and then we successfully managed to turn the corner. There was a short window, though, between that period and the beginning of the COVID crisis. In that short window, then I played golf once every 2 weeks as a way to come back to relaxing. But it was a short-lived window, because then came the largest crisis ever. And again, we were wondering as the policymakers, will Pakistan, how bad will the hit be in lives and in livelihoods? And that took several months to come as well. So it was never a dull moment in that job, Murtaza, and it was never a dull moment with issues both within the state bank and also within the broader financial and economic developments in the country.
Yes, incidentally, our current governor, Nandalal Veerasinghe, also likes to play golf. So next time you're here, we will connect you with him. So you moved on from the Central Bank of Pakistan. And finally, what are you doing now?
So now, Mirza, when my term ended, I was pretty soon after the end of my term appointed as a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government at the Musawwar Rahmani Center for Business and Government, which is a center that's run by Larry Summers, the former US Treasury Secretary and also former president of Harvard University. I'm doing research there on areas related to sovereign debt restructuring, having led that division in the IMF for 4 years and then having some perspectives as a central bank governor of a high debt country. So that was the first thing I started on. And since then, and while I continue that role, I have joined a global professional advisory services firm, Alvarez and Marsal, which is a firm that has developed its reputation originally for being the industry leader on corporate restructuring, and over the years has diversified into a whole host of areas. It was the vision of this firm to begin to do for countries that it had been doing very successfully for companies. And they hired me as the global practice leader and managing director for a new global offering called Sovereign Advisory Services. And the ethos, the goal of this practice is to offer a holistic set of services to ministers of finance and central bank governors, which are experiencing sovereign debt distress. It is not a narrow offering, as in just helping a country conduct a debt exchange or a temporary issuance of some new liquidity, but rather helping them address broader financial issues on the Ministry of Finance and the central bank side, including foreign exchange management type issues, including many issues pertaining to just debt management. Second, to help in the area of state-owned enterprises, because in many countries right now, Sri Lanka is one example, there are many others, part of the fiscal problem comes about from losses in state-owned enterprises. And Alvarez and Marsal can leverage its 4 decades long history in corporate restructuring to be able to help tackle the problem that is leading to a debt buildup and offer services for operational, financial restructuring of state-owned enterprises as well as their divestiture. The third area is helping country authorities where there are big sovereign financial linkages. And after the global financial crisis, after the collapse of Lehman, a number of European countries had such issues. And Alvarez and Marsal, for instance, designed the bank bail-in strategy in Cyprus, which was epitomized the sovereign financial linkages, as well as in many other countries. And finally, sovereign wealth funds. Many countries, including high debt countries, have sovereign wealth funds. So the goal of this new practice is to offer a holistic set of services to be able to address primarily fiscal, macroeconomic, monetary issues in a comprehensive manner and help those countries, and there are a lot of them now, get successfully through the upcoming challenges of rolling over unprecedentedly high stocks of public debt at much higher global interest rates than we have seen over the last couple of decades.
Thank you very much, Reza Baqir, for for the time that you spent. You have an amazing story, and I hope that it sounds inspirational. And we hope that down the road, we can be in touch.
Murtaza, thank you very much for hosting me. I really enjoyed the conversation with you, and looking forward to seeing you soon when I am in Colombo next.
Goodbye.
Thank you.